computer. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angela Walton-Raji, and we're here for our Monday afternoon genealogy chat. And today I'm very excited to welcome Ian McCants, a son of Oklahoma, via Tatum's and other parts of Indian Territory, Choctaw and Chickasaw Freedman descendant person as well. Ian, you were sharing with me a little bit earlier something that you had discovered, but you were also, this resulted, from what I understand, from a conversation that you were having with someone earlier today. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so your conversation was about your history and what unfolded after that.
So after my conversation with the reporter, I was just Googling some background information for her. So I was talking about the equity case. So I was mentioning my family's relationship to the equity case.
Yes.
Via the Franklins.
And your family specifically with the family that you were looking for in terms of the equity case. You're referring to equity case 7071 for those who are not familiar with it.
Equity case 7071, yes.
Mm-hmm. And so what did you share and what have you found?
So I had a couple of lines on equity case 7071. So I was talking about one of them with her, which was the Franklin. So I shared some information on them. And I shared also your article that I'm always sharing irony and opportunity in the Chickasaw Nation that came from that conversation we were having about the Chickasaw Nation when they falsely claimed that the nation was a place of refuge from enslavement.
Right, a refuge on the auction block. Yeah. Right, I remember, yes. Right. So you've been interested in really just discussing the history. It's okay to acknowledge that slavery took place. And certainly, many people, I guess, want to distance themselves from this reality, but it did happen. And there's amazingly rich history to find if one is honest and speaks to truth. So share what you shared and share what you found.
So after I was looking at the Franklins, I was looking at another line of my family, which were like the Love/Newberries.
Yes.
So I was trying to find some of that information. I just gave a quick Google search with my ancestors named Caldonia Love, and a document popped up that was about the ownership of my ancestors. And it was from a New York auction block. And it had recently been sold. And I was very upset because the moment I saw it, I was thinking that, we could all try to get together and
purchase the document, right?
You just have that one page, but it's a 10-page document that really lays out the issue with Benjamin Love, who was a Chickasaw statesman and a slave owner, and the people he had enslaved who he had failed to make payments on.
Okay, this is from an auction house in New York, and the price of the document, in fact, I'm looking at it and I'm going to share my screen while you continue to talk.
Yes, it sold for $2,600.
And at the time, it was being sold, I guess it was, can you all see my screen while we talk?
It's coming up.
Let me know when you can see it.
Yeah. Higher than that.
Okay, so, this is what I guess the way it appeared, certainly on the website. And this is the actual document. But can you tell us a little bit about what you found when you landed on this website, which, by the way, is Swan Galleries. This is the auction house that actually was selling this document. So you took a look at this and, what did you see? And tell us a little bit more.
I've been researching like my family history for years, so I immediately knew who this document was and who it was pertaining to. Like I saw several names I was familiar with and some that I wasn't, but the one I was most familiar with was, of course, Benjamin Love.
Yes, whose name is mentioned right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you can see the name of Benjamin Love. This, by the way, for those who are curious, and I think someone's phone's ringing there, for those who are curious, is a case involving the sale of 5 human beings sold between Native people in Texas. And there are 19 manuscript pages that were being auctioned off. And it's involving the slaveholder of your ancestor, Benjamin Love. And that's a name familiar to many of us who descend from Freedman, and who researched the history of Oklahoma. Freedman, well, it wasn't Oklahoma at the time, but it's a name that's familiar to many of us. And as you can see, he was an interpreter. He owned numerous individuals and held them enslaved. But most importantly, and a name that I actually recommend because I've known you, I've known Terry, and others who descend from a woman, I recognize. And when I saw the name of this enslaved woman, the name I knew was Caldonia Newberry. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm looking, and one can see that the individuals were named, namely, follow my cursor. Okay, in 1848, the following named Negro slaves, namely Maria, Mary Ann, Margaret, Catherine, is that Leander or Leonidas? Leonidas, thank you, and Caldonia. And I went, Caldonia, wait a minute, could this be Caldonia, who later is known as Caldonia Newberry to others? When you saw this, tell us how you reacted to finding this document where there's this effort to sell a woman called Caldonia, and is this your Caldonia?
I felt a lot of ways when I saw this document, but mostly I found it interesting because they were living outside of Indian Territory.
Yes.
They were in Grayson County, which is a county on the border of Oklahoma and Texas.
Right.
And when I was familiar with the history of Benjamin Love and with the history, of the mixed blood people of these nations who owned enslaved Black people and signed treaties with the U.S. government. Correct. And the thing that I think that as freedmen, we really have to do is have a real good understanding of Southeastern Native history and the politics of Southeastern Native tribes, because that's the context that our ancestors lived their lives.
Yes.
And for them, they really understood these nations to a T, because the things that happened in them greatly impacted them, and to a greater extent, I would say, than to the mixed blood people that owned them. And that's something some people would be very, shook that I said. But I think that it's true when you look at the decisions these people were making, and the fact that the people that they were enslaved were bearing the brunt of those decisions. When these people were signing treaties with the U.S. government for removal, the people that were signing the treaties that were slave owners, the people that enslaved them were having to deal with the consequences of their actions. And many of these people were also their relatives and children.
Right, very correct. But that's, of course, the nature and the heartbreak of Black chattel slavery in North America in particular. Individuals owned by people who were their kinsmen and women. Yeah. And that is
too that I think is really important that we understand is that these people weren't particularly popular in their own nations.
Right.
Just because these people signed treaties with the U.S. government, I think that we have to understand that not just in the Chickasaw or Choctaw Nation, tribes throughout the country signing treaties was not something that was particularly smiled upon.
Right, it was not admired.
Without the consent of a majority of the people in the tribe, people that were signing treaties were misleading the people that they were telling about what happened. And that's the case with Benjamin Love and some of the other leaders of the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma. Some of the chiefs of the Cherokee Nation, for example, who signed the treaties of removal, were so unpopular and faced being murdered that they moved to Texas. Correct. And that is the same reason that Colonel Benjamin Love was in Texas.
Very, very interesting that you pointed that out.
He was a federal interpreter during the treaties.
Yes.
And he surveyed the land that the Chickasaw people were removed to, and he went to the Chickasaw people and told them that the land that they were moving to was similar and as good as the land that they were living on in Mississippi, which was not the case. True. And when they found out about that, he couldn't continue to live in that community. And you have in that part of Texas along the border, there's a really long history of people who were involved in chattel slavery being on that border because of how unpopular they were in their own tribe. So you have Cherokee people who were living in Texas because of signing treaties. You had Chickasaw people during the Civil War. When the Union was winning, a majority of the Confederates moved down to the border of Texas and Oklahoma along the Red River. And that's where they had their encampments for a majority of the Civil War. That's where a lot of the people that they were enslaved to went as well. There were people that were sold into Texas when Chickasaw people were trying to get rid of their slaves when they realized that the war was ending. And there are cases similar to this document out of Texas that deal with people that were enslaved from Indian territory who were living in Texas because of the results of the mixed blood people who owned them.
When did you find this document?
The moment, Angela, the moment I find stuff, I'm texting you, I'm calling you. So as soon as I saw it, you saw it.
Well, I'm curious because I recognize the name Caldonia. I recognize the name Benjamin Love as well. And again, I've been researching certainly history of freedmen and their history and their culture that were deeply entrenched into the communities where they lived. And so it's something that in particular, I was very interested in knowing when you realize what you were looking at. In fact, before I even ask that question, this is the same Benjamin Love that was connected is this the one connected to Betty? To Betty Ligon of the equity case?
Yes, because Benjamin Love's relative, I think it was his brother, was Robert Howard Love, who was Betty Ligon's father.
Okay, so there is still connection there. You saw this and you saw Caldonia.
Mm-hmm.
Your reaction to seeing her?
It made me think about our ancestors and how they really, their lives depended so much on the people that enslaved them, to where they understood that their decisions impacted their lives and the lives of their family. Like if they made a bad business decision, that meant that you could be sold away from your family. And so they always had to be cognizant of what their owners were doing, what their owners' business plans were. And so I think our ancestors were very savvy in that way and have an understanding of doing what they needed to do to keep their families together.
I'm going to share that document one more time because I want to ask you about some of the others who are on that document. Again, you're looking at a record from 1848. And those of you just joining us, I'm speaking with Ian McCants, who just found a document reflecting his family, his ancestors, who were, there's this effort to sell them in 1848. Benjamin Love, who's one of an important leader that came out of the community. But as we look at, as it says, the following Negro slaves, if you can see where my mouse is right there, do you know the names of any of the others? Maria, we see Maria, Mary Ann, Margaret, Catherine, Leonidas, and of course, Caldonia. Did you know any of these other names? Do you recognize these names?
Yes, and that's the thing. I feel like with Freedman names, you always recognize the names, and that's what makes it tricky because there are multiple Marias that I know in the family. And
Yes.
So that could be a sister or that could be a mother, and Caldonia's mother was named Maria.
And what's so significant about this is that this is before the Civil War. This is not a Dawes card where someone is mentioning by name who the slaveholder was, the person who kept them in bondage. Here they were in bondage, and here their names are appearing on this document reflecting a possible transaction to unfold. And this is a rare find. And it's one of those things that had you not done that initial search in terms of just saying, well, let me see. I just spoke to this lady about my history. Let's see if there's something else I've been missing lately. And this popped up. Incredible find because you're now looking at it. And this is what makes this rare. This is looking at the history of enslaved people coming out of Indian territory. Most people have no idea slavery took place in Indian territory to this day. And even your typical student of history today, when they look at the typical maps that depict the history of slavery before the Civil War, you always see those maps where the states are shaded in by color, and the darker the color means the larger the population of enslaved people. Well, we all know where Texas is on a map, and we do know that certainly with slavery, we know where Texas is. Right up above Texas is what is now Oklahoma, but it was Indian Territory in the 1860s. It's always empty, as if there was no one ever enslaved. Yet, it's extremely well documented. And for you to find this record reflecting your family being sold again, but now as an artifact. Wow, this is, and particularly from this lesser known aspect of history, even though it is extremely well documented. You said you put in a call to the auction house to ask about the
I
purchase.
did, to find out who purchased the document, because I want to get
Were they helpful?
the full all of the pages to see what's entailed in it, because what I know about the Loves and the Newberries from the Dawes roll, Caldonia Newberry has a different owner, because when Benjamin Love went back to Indian Territory, eventually he was murdered. He was assassinated.
Right.
Like so many Native leaders were that signed treaties.
Correct. Well, did you find anything? Were they helpful when you called the gallery?
I was able to leave a message with someone who would be able to help me, but they haven't returned my call yet. So I'm hoping to hear from them soon, because I want to get a full copy of all those pages.
And to find that they have not resold it themselves. And but this is why oftentimes we really need really a collective, a group of individuals who are interested in preservation of history. For someone, the gallery made some money. They sold it, and they made some money on this piece of paper. But this is a rare piece of paper that's reflecting a history that we share in this room with those of us researching Freedman from Indian Territory rarely see. We can't just go to a courthouse in Oklahoma and ask to see, can you have an estate inventory of someone who was willing their slaves to their descendants or what have you. So our experience as researchers is slightly different, and frequently you're going to find things such as what you have found in an auction house. Thank goodness they kept the page up, and hopefully, should other similar documents appear, one might be able to acquire them. But wow, did you call the journalist back and let that person know what you had since discovered? I mean, I think it's certainly a story that's worth telling.
Right, I haven't yet, but I plan to.
You may want to do that. There may be an interest there, but that's absolutely.
I think it really shows the complexities of slavery and slavery in Indian Territory, because people like to flatten it and act like enslavement was just limited to the people who own slaves, and there's nothing that could be further from the truth. Like, slavery was an economic system.
Absolutely.
And any economic system depends on more than just the people who are owning a certain means of production.
Correct.
Right?
And there were other people.
CEO of McDonald's, but the McDonald's couldn't run with that one CEO. And the same thing is true for slavery in Indian Territory. If 3%, 4%, 5% of citizens of these tribes owned slaves, slavery wouldn't have been able to be maintained as an economic system if only 4% of Choctaw people or Chickasaw people or Creek people were participating in chattel slavery. There were people that were blacksmiths that were making chains. There were slave catchers. There were people that were publishing runaway slave articles in the newspaper and the nations at the time. It was an economic system. There were people that were leasing slaves. You could buy slave labor for a short period of time, for a season, to harvest a crop. Native people at infrastructure. Enslaved people played a huge part in building the infrastructure of Indian Territory. Boarding schools, Spencer Academy, Wheelock. There were freedmen who were at these boarding schools that were leased. And that's how we got the stories of Wallace Willis and
Spencer Academy.
Roll Jordan Roll. That's how those Negro spirituals got known, because of Choctaw people that were enslaved, Black Choctaw people that were enslaved, that were working at boarding schools, and a Presbyterian minister came across them singing these songs that they had been singing, being enslaved along the Red River in that part of Oklahoma.
Absolutely, absolutely correct. Well, certainly appreciate your sharing that information with us, because it is very, very significant. And the fact that you were able to find such a document, um, just, I mean, again, this is what, 50 years before the Dawes era, 50 years earlier. Here was someone trying to sell your ancestor in, what was it, Grayson County, Texas. And, but it's a name that's not unknown to many of us who are Freedman descendants, who research Choctaw and Chickasaw people. We know the name Caldonia. We know Caldonia, Newberry. We know Benjamin Love. And of course, we have other similar names in the other tribes as well.
And that's where Love County in Oklahoma comes from.
And this is such an important thing. And it's so interesting to watch people in some of the social media groups. You know, of course, everyone has something to say when it comes to people of African descent, getting anything, but especially in light of an open letter that you had written 2 weeks ago. Just that sort of discussion. Well, it's about culture. It's about blood. It's about everything. These are people who have no ties. And well, only, as you pointed out, only 2%, 3%, 4% were slaveholders. Has nothing to do with the rest of us, but it does. Were your ancestors, again, working on their own farms? Who provided assistance to grow those crops? Who was an overseer? That was their job, an overseer. Someone, it was part of the economic system. One of the members of our group, Athena, she's not here today. Her folks came out of Monroe Mission, out of Holly Springs, Mississippi, before removal. Detailed information about Reverend Gunn and Rhoda and people that enslaved, and Dinah and Dinah's mother, and the descendants of those enslaved people before removal, well documented, and people who spoke the language and lived within that culture. And so tremendous. I appreciate your sharing this with us, Ian. I can't thank you enough. Any final words before I stop recording this portion? Anything else you want to say about that discovery?
I think it's really important. Like, there's just so many connections that I see here, from like my ancestors' experience in Texas to go all the way back to Mississippi,
Yes.
before removal in the Chickasaw Nation when it comes to enslavement, because there was a case that helped determine white women's ability to own slaves in the United States that came out of the Chickasaw Nation. There was a Chickasaw woman who had a white husband, and that's usually how interracial marriages in the Chickasaw Nation happened. And then their mixed race children would go on to inherit the slaves that their white father owned. And because their mother was Chickasaw and the tribe was matrilineal, their children would be considered Chickasaw. And that's really how there became a mixed race class of people that were owning people of African descent in the nation. But what was interesting was there was a legal argument that happened because the white man that she was married to was so bad with managing money that he had gambled away all of his money, and then their slaves were going to be sold. And so she made the argument that because she was Chickasaw and her husband had married into the Chickasaw Nation, that she was the property owner, because women in the Chickasaw Nation were property owners, and therefore was the owner of the slaves, therefore they couldn't be sold. And so that became a scheme throughout the South for white men to use their wives, basically it's like an offshore bank account, to make sure that their enslaved property was secured. And so I think that that's really interesting when we look at how so much of our ancestors' lives were determined by the decisions of the people that owned them. And when you look at the Dawes roll, if you look at the census cards on the Dawes roll, you'll see who owned your ancestors. And what you find a lot of the times is that our families were owned by people over generations.
Yes, that is correct.
And even the people that Benjamin Love failed to make payments to that he owned were from the Choctaw Nation as well.
Right, that is correct.
There's that extended kinship network. And I think that when you look at freedmen and who are families married, it's people who were in close connection to those families as well. And because that was such a small community, because we lived in these tribes. And so I hear people that are not from, their citizens of these tribes say that, oh, maybe some freedmen have blood ties to the nation. But I think that the reality is that most of us have blood ties to the nation because over generations, from pre-removal, the 1700s to the 1960s, in some families, people were marrying other freedmen descendants. So when you have these huge family trees of freedmen from different parts of the nation, but they're all related to these tribes, you're going to have ancestors with blood ties. That's why I have 3 different lines of my family that are on the equity case, because these people married other freedmen. They had like 10 children. Their children married people from down the road here, down the road there, and then they married freedmen from the Choctaw Nation or here and there. And we have these extended kinship networks that are very large. And I think that when you do your genealogy work and really get to understand like our early lines in our family, when you go to Oklahoma, you find a billion cousins.
Yes, you will. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
One more thing, and I'm going to share the document just one more time, and you can just explain to those who may not know, on this particular document from 1848, as they list the Negro slaves that Benjamin Love is trying to sell. Caldonia is who to you? Who is Caldonia? Who became Caldonia, Missouri?
Caldonia is my 5th or 6th great grandmother, I want to say.
So she,
great grandmother.
Okay, and so she is a direct ancestor of yours, and she was on the Dawes Roll. Is that not correct? I think
that's correct.
Okay, she was on the Dawes Roll. She ended up on the Choctaw Roll. She was a Choctaw. Okay. Chickasaw, sorry. Okay. So, but this is something that is important, and certainly the greater lesson is really, as researchers, we have to look everywhere. And as he happened to, after ending a conversation with a journalist, and of course it just got his mind sort of thinking, what else could I have mentioned? Did I forget something? And he's just doing a simple Google search, and he finds this document that was auctioned off, reflecting his ancestors and the people that had enslaved them, which is absolutely incredible. I want to thank you for allowing me just to
and I want to say too, another thing is, like, when I think about this, so many of the decisions that the people that owned our ancestors made impacted their families and their identities, because these people had lived, like, I know Maria, if it's the older woman, had lived in the Chickasaw Nation throughout her life in Mississippi, and then had gone to Oklahoma. And so these people were very much Chickasaw people, had lived their lives in the Chickasaw Nation. And now they were forced to live in Texas around people that were not surrounded by a large group of other freedmen, not surrounded by their family members and their relatives, because of the person that owned them being a treaty signer.
Absolutely amazing, incredible story. And I appreciate your willing just to share this with us. So thank you very much. And I will stop the recording at this point. Thank you so much, Ian.